So we continue with this study of public corporations. So in the previous lesson, we did talk about what a corporation is, what its aims and objectives, as well as how it is formed. And today we want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of public corporations. That is what we want to talk about. So just a recap from what we did previously. We talked about corporations, and we gave a definition for corporations. We said that a corporation is an organization or a business formed by a group of people which has got its own rights and liabilities separate from those of the individuals. It's like it has got the same features with a limited companies, but of course they are similar, not same. They're similar, but with some notable differences. A corporation is regarded as this much larger entity compared to some private limited or public limited companies. So a corporation has got its own rights and liabilities separate from those of the people who are forming the corporation or the organization. That is a corporation. Now, we want to define a public corporation. Now, a public corporation is formed by an act of legislature or an act of parliament and is owned by the state. Its mission and objectives is to carry out public missions and services. That is for a public corporation. So we have got, for example, in local corporations, we can talk about Copperbelt Energy Corporation, Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, Zambia Medical Stores of Zambia. Because yes, I come from Zambia, so those examples are examples of public corporations with a mandate to carry out public missions and services. Alright, so let's get to what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of public corporations. And we're going to start with the advantages of a public corporation. Why is it so important to have a public corporation? What does it bring to the table? The pros, the pros of having a public corporation. So these are some of the important factors involved in establishing a public corporation. Number one is economies of scale. What does economies of scale mean? So it means, economies of scale refers to where the average cost of production declines as production picks up. So the cost falls as the production increases. The more you produce, the less it costs for you to produce. The average cost is declining. So that is what we call economies of scale. So you find like these companies, they're producing lots and lots of goods or lots and lots of services for less. That is called economies of scale. And a public corporation has got that benefit of enjoying economies of scale, since they are large enough to be able to enjoy economies of scale, whereby they produce more goods at a cheaper cost. So that is for economies of scale. Since the public corporations are very big, definitely they do enjoy or benefit from the economies of scale, including producing things at a cheaper price and better quality of service. That can also be said for like Zesco Limited, whereby the good they produce is at a price cheaper than that of the market, and they also produce better quality of service. generally for public corporations. Not there, of course, there are some examples we can talk about which are not doing that, but generally for a public corporation that is the case. And because public corporations are owned by the government, it's easier to plan and coordinate a public corporation. So coordination of a public corporation is very easy in planning because they are owned by the government. And since the government can easily take over certain terms, certain items, or give certain instructions that can benefit the general public. So running and planning a public corporation is much easier. We can cite some examples where we've had public corporations receiving favors, so to say, from the government, and that makes them easier to operate. Even when they are making a loss, they do carry on their work. So that is because they are owned by the government. Okay. And third point, autonomous setup. So public corporations can have an autonomous setup which can offer great flexibility in terms of public corporations operations. Okay, so just because it is owned by the state doesn't mean that they're not operating as an autonomous entity. Of course, they are operating as an autonomous entity. The state is not required in the day-to-day running of the company. Because they own it doesn't mean the state has to interfere in the operations of the company. So the management, the board of directors for the corporation manages the entire activities and monitors, supervises the entire activities of the corporation, but the government does not interfere. So there's that autonomous setup for a public corporation, which is an added advantage. The fourth one, we can talk about public corporations having protection of public interest. So what does it mean to have a protection of public interest? So public corporations can also create policies and procedures to promote public welfare. Their main interest is to promote the welfare of the public. So they can make activities or programs that help promote the welfare of the public. So that is on the protection of public interest. That was number 4. I think that's clear enough. Then number 5, quicker decisions. So decisions in a public corporations can be made rather quickly, since we have got less and less bureaucracy. So those are the disadvantages. We can make decisions quicker because we've got less bureaucracy. And 6, raising funds through private sourcing. Public corporations can also raise funds through private sourcing or other means other than just getting from the government, loans from the government or grants. They can also get funds from bonds and loans from other sources. But if they plan to borrow from another country, another nation, they have to get permissions and written permission from the government. But where private funding comes in, the corporation can get that the funds by issuing bonds, and sometimes they are not required to obtain funds only from government sources, or they are not required to obtain funds from only government sources. They can also obtain funds from other sources. So these are the advantages of a public corporation. Hope those were clear enough. So now let's jump to the disadvantages of a public corporation. talking about the disadvantages of a public corporation. Disadvantages: number one is that it is difficult to manage a public corporation. We're talking about management of a public corporation because several meetings will be required with a lot of government officials just to make a decision. Okay, so whilst decisions can be made quickly, the decision-making process can also become quite slow if we have to hold a lot of meetings just for us to make a decision. So during times when the company has to make some decisions, some decision-making processes can drag the act of making a decision, so making the process quite slow if several members have to be present just to make a decision during a meeting. So sometimes it can become difficult to manage, where you have someone from the government to come in, someone from this ministry, someone from just you have to be present before you make a decision and purchasing this or doing that. So it might be difficult to manage a public corporation. So risk of producing inefficient products. Okay, this is a major problem with most public corporations around the world. That is, these businesses can end up producing lower quality products, and sometimes their products can be overpriced, particularly because they have the funds and they can't go bankrupt. They don't depend on the sales and income produced from their services and goods to keep running, because they can always get money from the government and they can always have other sources of income. So they produce inefficient products. This has been much the complaint of the public for public corporations, for example, production of electricity, broadcasting services, and other services. Public corporations have received much criticism on that. And the other reason is because there is no or little competition to fully understand the price point and quality. They have little competition, so whatever they produce, definitely the public will have to get on with that. So the risk of producing inefficient products. The third disadvantage of a public corporation is financial burden. If a public corporation suffers a loss, the government will provide subsidies to cover such loss. For example, I'll go down to public corporations like electricity producing companies, which are public corporations, and milling food production companies. They'll receive subsidies from government to cover for their losses. So the more loss you find that the more loss that the business incurs, the more that the government have to spend on them, which will cause a strain on government resources, because they'll have no option but to give them money to fund them so that they keep running their for public interest. So the government will keep spending on them so the public corporation will be like a financial burden on national resources or government resources. And the other one is political interference with public corporations. While we did mention that they have an autonomous setup, public corporations may be thought of as a disadvantage due to the political interference, since the government owns these businesses and corporations. So they have this immunity. This could make some government officials to misuse their power and they engage in corruption when it comes to political interference. We've seen stories where companies have been awarded contracts which they weren't really able to fully comply with the terms and conditions, and or to deliver items which they definitely could not deliver the required quality. So we've had a lot of corruption cases when it comes to public corporations, and these are the ones which are involved mostly with corrupt scandals because of this political interference. Since they're owned by the government, hence government officials feel like they can use these as vehicles to benefit themselves. So we've had cases where we've political interference in public corporations. They can easily become vehicles of political interference. And number 5 is, of course, which is related to political interference, is misuse of power. So a lot of these public corporations operate as monopolies since there isn't much competition. So these businesses could function improperly since they might have less focus on improving their the products which they are offering, and the customer service might be very poor, might not be a top priority. So which takes us to the next disadvantages of public corporations. And now we can jump to the consumer interests ignored. We talked about the customer service not being a top priority when it comes to public corporations, and that has been the case where public corporations do not have the worst customer service because the consumer interest is practically ignored, since they don't need to make a profit for them to survive, because even with a loss they'll still be in business and they'll still be operating for years to come. So consumer interests sometimes are ignored. And the next point would be expensive to maintain and operate. So public corporations can be expensive to maintain and operate. They might engage in some antisocial activities such as charging too much money for goods or providing goods that are not sufficient or good enough for the consumers. So we might experience what we call antisocial activities such as charging too much for goods or products that are not sufficient for consumers. So we can keep in mind that the public corporations, they are not only beneficial for very big state businesses, but also for small businesses. So public corporations these are the advantages and disadvantages for public corporations that we can mention so far. Okay, so we can do well to go through the list of the advantages and disadvantages for public corporations. So for now, that is it, and we'll see you in the next lesson.